As Avianca Flight 052 makes its way through the tumultuous skies above New York, the crew is preparing for a situation far from ordinary. The aircraft is being battered by fierce rain and howling winds, pushing forward toward John F. Kennedy International Airport on a wintry day. To the casual observer, it may seem like any other flight, but for the pilots on board, the tension is palpable. There's a knot in their stomachs, not just from the turbulence, but from a growing realization that this situation is anything but routine. New York's airspace is one of the busiest and most complex in the world, with 3 major international airports within just a few miles of each other and another 35 smaller airports in the vicinity. The region is a marvel of air traffic management. The system in place ensures that aircraft flow efficiently and safely into the area, operating almost like an intricate choreography. It works so well, in fact, that incidents in this airspace are incredibly rare. But for the crew and passengers of Avianca Flight 052 on January 25, 1990, they are about to become the exception to that rule. Avianca, the flag carrier of Colombia, is one of the oldest airlines in the world, founded long before many of today's international giants. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Avianca had a fleet that included the Boeing 747 for long-haul flights, the Boeing 727 for short-haul routes, and the aging Boeing 707 for medium-range services. The Boeing 707-320C was an older, 4-engine narrow-body jet that had entered service in the late 1950s. While the 707 had been revolutionary in its time, by 1990, it was already considered outdated. However, its range of over 6,000 nautical miles made it perfect for Avianca's flights between Colombia and New York. On this day, it was the flight from Medellin, the one with flight number 052, that would face a fate unlike any other. The crew consisted of 3 members: a captain with over 16,000 hours of flying time, including 1,500 on the 707, a first officer who was much younger, with just under 2,000 hours, only 64 of which were on the 707, and a flight engineer who had logged over 10,000 hours, including 3,000 on the 707. Despite their experience, there was a significant gap in seniority between the captain and first officer, so much so that the captain had joined Avianca only 3 months after the first officer was born. The disparity in experience, combined with outdated training techniques, would soon become critical. In 1990, Avianca hadn't yet implemented Crew Resource Management, CRM, a crucial training system that helps flight crews work together as a team. This lack of CRM, coupled with language barriers, since the captain was not fluent in English, would play a pivotal role as events unfolded. The aircraft itself, a 22-year-old Boeing 707, had a number of deferred maintenance issues from the previous flight. While none were considered catastrophic, there were a few concerns. Most significantly, the autopilot system was out of service. This would require the crew to fly the aircraft manually, increasing their workload, especially during a long flight like this one. Additionally, the flight director, which provides visual guidance for pilots during approaches, was malfunctioning. This failure meant that the pilots would have to fly the approach into New York using only basic instruments, relying on raw data from the aircraft's deviation indicators. This made an already difficult task even more challenging. Flying without autopilot and a malfunctioning flight director meant that the crew would have to manually maintain the aircraft's course and path during the approach. This is a technique known as raw data flying, where the pilots rely on basic instruments, such as the deviation indicators for the glide slope and localizer, to navigate. This process is far more taxing and error-prone than flying with autopilot or a functioning flight director, making it a particularly difficult challenge for the crew. The technical issues and lack of support systems on board were not unique to this flight. In many ways, the challenges faced by Flight 052 mirror those seen in other major aviation incidents. One such example is Air France Flight 4407, where similar issues of autopilot and manual control under difficult conditions led to disaster. Both incidents underscore the critical importance of crew training, communication, and the reliability of aircraft systems, especially under extreme conditions. As Avianca Flight 052 approaches the final leg of its journey, the crew is faced with an increasingly difficult situation. The weather is worsening, and the malfunctioning systems are pushing the crew to their limits. They are about to enter one of the busiest and most complex airspaces in the world, and their situation is about to spiral out of control. Stay tuned as the tension mounts and the critical decisions that will determine the fate of Flight 052 unfold. As the flight crew of Avianca, Flight 052 prepares for their long journey from Medellin to New York, they face more than just the physical challenges of the flight. The approach into JFK will be complicated by malfunctioning systems on the aircraft, but the crew is confident in their preparations. The plane's fuel load has been carefully calculated to ensure they are ready for any contingency. In the event that they are unable to land at JFK, their alternate airport is Boston. The flight plan includes not only the required fuel for the trip to New York, but also enough to handle a missed approach and a diversion to Boston if necessary. Avianca's requirements for fuel are specific and comprehensive. The aircraft needs enough fuel to taxi, take off, reach its destination, and perform a missed approach. Additionally, it must have enough fuel to fly to the alternate airport and hold for 30 minutes at 1,500 feet before landing, all while accounting for reserve fuel. For the planned 4-hour and 40-minute flight, this totals approximately 6 hours and 8 minutes of fuel, or about 73,930 pounds. To ensure an extra safety margin, Avianca's policy is to carry more fuel than the minimum requirement, bringing the total fuel load to 82,000 pounds. This gives the flight crew a sense of security, knowing they've taken on more fuel than necessary for the trip. Little do they know, however, that unforeseen circumstances at their destination will soon begin to test the limits of their preparations. As the aircraft prepares for departure from Medellin's runway 36, everything appears to be in order. With 149 passengers and a 9-member crew on board, the flight seems poised for a smooth journey. The crew is unaware, though, that the conditions over New York are deteriorating quickly. They don't yet grasp the full scope of the challenges they will soon face. Meanwhile, back at the FAA's Central Flow Control Facility in Washington, D.C., aviation experts are already anticipating the worsening weather conditions over the northeastern United States. A large low-pressure system is moving up the eastern seaboard, bringing low overcast, fog, precipitation, and high winds to the region. By the time Avianca Flight 052 departs from Medellin, the conditions are already expected to worsen. The FAA specialists have been discussing how to handle these adverse conditions for hours. The Central Flow Control Facility, known as Flow Control, is the epicenter of U.S. air traffic management, responsible for ensuring that demand and capacity align as conditions change. Flow Control's primary role is to manage air traffic, ensuring that airports do not become overwhelmed, especially during poor weather conditions. When visibility decreases or winds become too strong, the number of flights that can land at a major airport drops. As a result, the number of aircraft en route to that airport must also be reduced. This is where Flow Control steps in. When the capacity of an airport is reduced due to weather, Flow Control institutes what is known as a restrictive program, which can include delaying departures or ordering a ground hold for flights destined for the affected airport. While these delays can be frustrating for passengers, they are a much safer option than allowing aircraft to continue towards an airport that may not be able to accept them. On the day of this incident, Flow Control had already begun to anticipate the need for restrictive programs for New York's major airports, including JFK. The weather was expected to deteriorate further, likely dropping below the landing minimums. The FAA was aware that these conditions would severely limit the ability of planes to land, including those already in the air. The situation at JFK was becoming increasingly precarious, but Flight 052 was still on its way, unaware of the challenges awaiting them. This complex network of aviation logistics and air traffic management would soon collide with the technical difficulties faced by the flight crew, setting the stage for a dangerous and ultimately tragic turn of events. As the plane nears New York, the crew will soon learn just how much the weather, along with their aircraft's technical issues, will complicate their final approach. To fully understand how the weather and air traffic control decisions affected Avianca Flight 052, it's crucial to look at the structure of the air traffic control system in the New York area. The entire United States is divided into 22 sectors, each managed by an Air Route Traffic Control Center, ARTCC. The New York ARTCC oversees air traffic over New York City and Long Island, along with parts of neighboring states. It is bordered by the Boston ARTCC to the north and the Washington ARTCC to the south. Aircraft bound for airports in New York airspace are handed off to an intermediate control facility called the TRACON midway through their descent. The TRACON's job is to guide incoming aircraft from the upper airspace into a network of designated approach corridors that lead to the 38 airports in the New York area, including JFK and LaGuardia. At the same time, TRACON handles aircraft departing from these airports, directing them to departure corridors that keep them separated from the incoming flights. Once an aircraft is on its final approach to an airport, the control is handed over from the TRACON to the airport's air traffic control tower, which manages the final moments of the flight, just long enough to clear the aircraft for landing. For managing the flow of air traffic, each airport's tower supervisors report their estimated capacity to the TRACON flow control specialists. These specialists then communicate with the Central Flow Control Facility, located in Washington, D.C., to adjust the flow of aircraft coming in. For instance, if the tower expects to only handle 35 aircraft per hour, but 40 aircraft are scheduled to arrive during that hour, flow control may delay the departure of certain flights from other airports to prevent congestion at JFK. However, flow control can only issue ground delays for flights departing from the U.S. They do not have control over international flights arriving from overseas. On the morning of the incident, flow control specialists were already aware that severe weather was heading toward the New York area. The TRACON specialist reported that forecasted conditions would likely reduce the acceptance rate at JFK to just 28 aircraft per hour, well below the normal capacity. But flow control wanted to maintain an acceptance rate of 32 aircraft per hour because more than 50 international flights from Europe had already departed and were scheduled to arrive later in the afternoon. These aircraft needed to land, and if the acceptance rate at JFK dropped too low, domestic flights would face severe delays, creating a backlog. The solution seemed clear to flow control: delay domestic flights to make room for the international arrivals. Flow control's decision, however, was not without its consequences. Despite the warnings from the TRACON specialist, the Central Flow Control Specialist decided that the program would assume an acceptance rate of 33 aircraft per hour at JFK, hoping to balance the needs of international and domestic flights. At this rate, domestic flights could expect an average ground delay of about 2 hours and 13 minutes, which would increase to 3 hours and 10 minutes if the acceptance rate was reduced further. Flow control made it clear that delays of 3 hours or more were unacceptable, as they would lead to widespread flight cancellations and significant disruption. This decision was made with the best intentions to avoid massive flight cancellations and chaos, but it would have unintended and dangerous consequences. By knowingly releasing more aircraft than JFK could handle, flow control was setting the stage for delays and congestion that would affect flights like Avianca Flight 052. As the weather worsened, air traffic controllers struggled to achieve the planned acceptance rate of 32 aircraft per hour. The system was already under strain, and Flight 052, along with other flights, would soon feel the full impact of these air traffic management decisions. As the day progressed, the weather in New York became even more unpredictable. The conditions that had been anticipated earlier in the day were now a reality, and the ability of air traffic controllers to manage the flow of aircraft was further compromised. For the crew of Flight 052, the situation was about to become far more critical, and the decisions made at the Flow Control Center would soon catch up with them. The consequences of pushing the system beyond its limits were starting to unfold, and the crew of Avianca Flight 052 had no way of knowing just how challenging the next few minutes would be. By the time Avianca Flight 052 departed Medellin at 15:08, the situation in New York was already deteriorating rapidly. The TRACON specialist had already warned Flow Control multiple times that their current plan wasn't working, as aircraft were being forced into airborne holds, waiting their turn to land. Despite these warnings, the weather continued to worsen. By 1600, the conditions in New York deteriorated further than anticipated. Up until that point, aircraft had been landing at JFK using both the 2 right and 2 left runways. However, the visibility at 2 right dropped below the minimum landing requirements, leaving only 1 usable runway for incoming traffic. This sudden shift in weather had been predicted by the forecast, but the timing was completely off. What was expected to happen later had arrived 4 hours ahead of schedule. Now, the Central Flow Control Facility needed to act quickly. The acceptance rate for JFK needed to be reduced, and a widespread ground stop should have been issued to prevent further congestion. Unfortunately, neither of these actions took place. As a result, the airborne traffic jam worsened, and by 1630, there were 39 aircraft waiting to land at JFK. By 1800, the number of landings per hour had dropped below 30, and New York's ARTCC was overwhelmed. Aircraft were being rerouted to the Washington ARTCC, and some flights were even forced to divert to alternate airports. As this chaos unfolded, Avianca Flight 052, unaware of the rapidly deteriorating situation, continued its flight toward New York, heading straight into the escalating traffic nightmare. In most cases, when pilots anticipate bad weather and potential delays, they stay in constant contact with their airline or air traffic control for the latest updates on weather conditions and air traffic. Pilots typically make requests for updated weather forecasts and traffic information to maintain situational awareness and plan for contingencies. However, this didn't happen on Flight 052. To understand why, we need to examine how the flight was dispatched and what information the crew received. A significant issue arose with the outdated weather forecasts that were provided to the pilots of Flight 052. These forecasts were already 9 to 10 hours old by the time the flight was dispatched. The forecast for JFK indicated poor visibility of just 1 mile in rain, with overcast clouds at 800 feet and winds gusting up to 30 knots. While still above the minimum landing requirements, this was far from ideal. The forecast for the alternate airport, Boston, was even worse, with visibility down to 3/4 of a mile in rain, overcast clouds at 500 feet, and winds gusting to 25 knots. Given these forecasts, you might already be wondering why Boston was chosen as the alternate airport in the first place, and rightly so. The problem stemmed from a flaw in the way Avianca's flight plans were prepared. The contractor responsible for drafting the flight plans used a computer system that automatically selected Boston as the alternate airport for flights to JFK, without checking whether the weather conditions were actually suitable. The dispatchers at Avianca didn't cross-check the weather reports for the alternate airports either. According to Avianca's procedures, the alternate airport should have had a cloud ceiling of at least 1,000 feet and visibility of 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles, both of which were clearly not met by Boston's weather on that day. To be fair, the pilots should have caught this mistake during their pre-flight checks, as verifying a suitable alternate airport is an essential part of their responsibilities. But, like many parts of this flight's preparation, it seems that the crew was simply going through the motions, and this crucial question was never raised. If the pilots had noticed the poor weather at Boston, they could have easily chosen an alternative, such as Buffalo or Syracuse, both of which met the weather requirements for an alternate airport. Unfortunately, that step was never taken. Even more concerning is the fact that the pilots did not request updated weather information during the flight. It is a standard procedure for pilots to request the latest weather updates, particularly when heading into an area where conditions are rapidly changing. However, there is no record of the flight crew requesting updated weather for JFK or any other relevant information. Investigators later found that there was no communication from the crew with Avianca Dispatch or any air traffic control facility along the route requesting current weather conditions. The lack of these basic checks and updates raises serious questions about the flight crew's awareness and decision-making. While we can't definitively explain why the crew failed to perform these duties, it is possible that complacency played a role. The combination of outdated information, lack of proactive communication, and a sense of routine may have led the crew to overlook critical factors that would have otherwise alerted them to the worsening conditions they were about to face. This lack of preparation would soon have devastating consequences as the situation in New York continued to spiral out of control. Avianca Flight 052 continued its journey toward New York, unaware of the growing storm of delays and congestion that awaited them. The flight had already passed through the Miami, Jacksonville, and Washington ARTCC sectors, and by 1904, they encountered the traffic bottleneck that had been building for hours. The Washington ARTCC, seeing the mounting congestion, placed Flight 052 into a holding pattern over Norfolk, Virginia, a staggering 215 nautical miles south of their destination. This was because all the holding points in New York's airspace were already full, as were the holding points in Washington's sector. After holding for 19 minutes, the flight was cleared to continue to the bolt-on intersection near Atlantic City. But the delays were far from over. By 1943, the aircraft entered another holding pattern over Atlantic City, as space in the New York sector remained scarce. During this time, the pilots were cleared to descend several times, which likely gave them the impression that they were making progress toward their destination. However, by 2009, after holding at Atlantic City for 26 minutes, the first officer requested information about potential delays into Boston. This was the first sign that the crew was becoming concerned about the escalating delays. The crew had been holding for 45 minutes at this point, and an additional 30 minutes of holding was now expected, which should have raised serious concerns about their fuel status. At this stage, the pilots should have already been calculating the fuel situation. In modern aviation, crews typically agree on a minimum diversion fuel level before departure. If they approach that fuel level during the flight, they can decide to divert to an alternate airport, especially when weather conditions are worsening. If the weather at the destination is uncertain, crews would prioritize having enough fuel to safely divert. This is a process managed today using flight management computers. However, in 1990, this responsibility fell on the flight engineer, and there is no evidence that the crew of Flight 052 ever calculated their diversion fuel level or assessed the situation adequately. By 2012, Flight 052 was cleared to continue north into the New York ARTCC sector, and they were subsequently cleared to the Cameron intersection, located 39 miles south of JFK. This is typically the point at which inbound aircraft are handed over from the ARTCC to the TRACON, which manages the final stages of an aircraft's approach. On this day, however, the airspace was overwhelmed, with aircraft stacked in holding patterns at multiple flight levels over Cameron. Because TRACON's job is to sequence aircraft for approach, it cannot hold aircraft in its airspace. Instead, it accepts new aircraft only when spaces open up in the landing queue. The situation was exacerbated by strong tailwinds from the south. As aircraft inbound from the south approached JFK, they initially experienced a strong tailwind, which would reduce to a headwind as they turned onto runway 22L for the final approach. This created a significant reduction in ground speed, necessitating larger separation between planes. The delay caused by this was compounded by the need for greater spacing in the approach corridor, further extending the wait times. For Flight 052, This meant that by the time they arrived over Cameron at 2018, they were the last aircraft in line to be cleared for approach. With 8 aircraft ahead of them, each requiring 5 minutes to cover the separation distance, it became clear that a minimum of 40 minutes of additional delay was inevitable. This, however, was not clear to the crew of Flight 052. They seemed unaware of the true extent of the delays that were building up. At 2018, when Flight 052 arrived at Cameron, they were instructed to expect further clearance at 2030, or about 12 minutes later. This likely led the crew to believe they would soon be cleared for the approach. However, what the controller meant was that they would expect to clear Flight 052 to descend further at that time, not necessarily to begin their final approach. The crew, likely focused on the optimistic estimate of 2030, did not realize that the situation was far more complicated, and their expectations for a quick resolution were about to be shattered. This misunderstanding, combined with the growing delay, was putting tremendous pressure on the crew to make decisions about their fuel and the safety of their approach. As the crew continued to wait in the holding pattern, they were unaware that their situation was becoming increasingly critical. Each minute of delay brought them closer to a point where fuel could become insufficient to handle the challenges ahead. The Avianca crew's understanding of the situation seemed to be clouded by a critical misunderstanding about the meaning of expected further clearance, EFC times. In modern aviation, the use of EFCs is rare, as it can lead to confusion about when an aircraft will be cleared for approach. The crew of Flight 052, likely unaware of the nuances of the terminology, assumed that when they were told to expect further clearance at 2030, it meant they would soon be cleared for an approach to JFK. Unfortunately, the controllers had only intended to clear them for a descent, not the approach itself. If the crew had been told that they were in indefinite holding, they might have made the decision to divert immediately to their alternate airport, or at least begin preparing for the possibility of a diversion. But that didn't happen. Instead, the crew continued to wait, operating under the assumption that they were moving closer to their destination. If the pilots had requested the latest weather updates, they would have learned that the conditions at JFK were now far worse than expected. Visibility had dropped to near landing minimums, combined with strong winds and rain. At 2035, JFK reported to Flow Control that 20% of all flights attempting to land on runway 22L had been forced to go around due to low visibility. Clearly, this was not the time to commit to an approach at JFK, but the pilots were likely caught in the trap of believing that once they received the clearance for approach, everything would be resolved. Their first EFC time of 2030 had passed without progress, but the controller then issued a new EFC of 2039, while also clearing the flight to descend to 11,000 feet. The pilots accepted this new clearance without protest, probably assuming that they were still making progress, despite the delays. When 2039 arrived and passed without further clearances, the crew likely began to grow concerned about their fuel situation. However, they should have been worrying about it far earlier, at least an hour before. By this point, the aircraft had been holding for a total of 1 hour and 9 minutes, depleting all the fuel required for the en route portion of the flight, most of the continuous fuel, and nearly all of their diversion fuel. In fact, they were now in a position where they would have to use their final reserve fuel to land at JFK. This reserve fuel, meant for real emergencies, is never supposed to be used except when absolutely necessary. Today, modern protocols dictate that if pilots expect to use any reserve fuel, they must immediately declare an emergency. This is done using the term Mayday, Mayday, Mayday fuel, which unequivocally signals to air traffic control that the aircraft needs priority handling to ensure a safe landing. At this point in the flight, the crew of Flight 052 had the right to use these emergency phrases. If they had, the outcome might have been very different. But instead of declaring an emergency, they continued to wait, passing their expected further clearance time. By 2044, when a new EFC of 2105 was issued, The pilots must have realized that they were running out of time. They might not have had enough fuel to reach JFK, and the situation was growing increasingly dire. In response, the first officer finally transmitted, "Well, I think we need priority." This phrase did convey some sense of urgency, but it fell short of the gravity required in this situation. In aviation, the word priority can expedite the process, but it does not carry the same level of urgency as terms like Mayday or Pan-Pan, which would compel air traffic controllers to clear the path for an immediate landing. The Boeing manuals related to fuel management on the 707 advised pilots to request priority in low fuel situations. However, other Avianca pilots testified that training with Boeing had led them to believe that priority would trigger the same response from air traffic control as an emergency declaration. This misconception about the term priority was critical. Had the crew understood that requesting priority wouldn't necessarily clear the way for an immediate landing, they might have made different decisions earlier, potentially averting the unfolding disaster. Unfortunately, the confusion surrounding terminology, combined with a growing complacency, contributed to their failure to take the necessary steps to safeguard their fuel and ensure a safe diversion or emergency landing. As the flight continued to circle in holding patterns, the crew was becoming more and more aware of their precarious position. But by then, the clock was ticking down, and with each passing minute, their chances of landing safely without depleting all their fuel were becoming slimmer. The decision-making errors that began with outdated information, misunderstandings about air traffic control procedures, and a failure to communicate effectively would soon have fatal consequences. This part of the story reveals a tragic series of miscommunications and misunderstandings that compounded the problems for Avianca Flight 052. When the first officer of Flight 052 requested priority, the New York ARTCC controller responded by asking how long they could hold and what their alternate airport was. The first officer replied that they could only hold for about 5 more minutes, meaning they would run out of fuel if they didn't start the approach soon. However, this response was misunderstood. The controller then asked for the alternate airport, and the first officer mentioned Boston, but indicated that it was already too congested to consider. This is where the crucial miscommunication occurred. The handoff controller, who was responsible for transferring the flight from ARTCC to TRACON, did not hear the first officer's clarification that they could no longer reach Boston due to fuel concerns. Instead, the controller assumed that after 5 more minutes of holding, the flight would have to divert to Boston, rather than realizing that the crew was concerned about not having enough fuel to reach JFK at all. This misunderstanding was compounded when the handoff controller failed to pass on the priority request to TRACON. As a result, when Flight 052 was cleared to exit the holding pattern, it wasn't given priority handling, which the crew might have believed they were receiving. The pilots, having waited so long and now hopeful that they were finally being cleared for approach, continued on their course toward JFK. However, their belief that they were being given priority was a false impression, and this would soon become evident. When they were cleared to exit the holding pattern, they were not given the proper separation from the aircraft ahead of them, leading to another complication. The TRACON controller instructed Flight 052 to turn right to heading 220, essentially putting them back into another holding pattern. If the flight had declared an emergency, air traffic control would have cleared the way for them. Instead, the pilots did not protest, possibly because they still believed they were being given priority. This lack of protest from the crew can be partly explained by the language barrier between the captain and the controller. It seems that the captain may not have fully understood the controller's transmissions, either due to his limited English proficiency or because he wasn't wearing his headset properly. As a result, the first officer had to repeat every single instruction to the captain, which added another layer of confusion. Without autopilot, the captain was hand-flying the aircraft, a task that requires full attention. This left little room for him to analyze the situation, listen to transmissions, or consider the seriousness of their fuel situation. The decision to fly the plane through this orbit, rather than questioning the controller or requesting further clarification, cost Flight 052 valuable time. They had already exceeded the time they could hold by about 6 minutes, an additional delay they couldn't afford. If they had been explicitly told they could hold for 6 minutes, they might have rejected the idea. But now, they were convinced that they were being given priority handling, and they rationalized the orbit as the fastest way to reach the runway, even though it wasn't. While the crew was caught up in this confusion, they were also receiving some concerning news. The controller informed them of wind shear on the approach, with a 10-knot change in wind speed at 1,500 feet, and again at 500 feet. This made the approach even more challenging. In the cockpit, the captain, confused by the controller's English transmission, asked, "What is he saying, wind shear?" The first officer responded by repeating the message in Spanish. The situation worsened when the crew tuned into the Automatic Terminal Information System, ATIS, to copy the latest weather report. The conditions were now dire. The cloud ceiling was at 200 feet, visibility had dropped to just a quarter of a mile, and there was light drizzle and fog with winds out of the southwest at 17 knots. These conditions were far worse than they had anticipated, and the crew now had to make a difficult decision. At this point, the crew was facing a complex and rapidly deteriorating situation. They had already consumed their fuel reserves while waiting and holding patterns, and now the weather conditions at JFK were deteriorating further, making a safe landing increasingly uncertain. The chain of misunderstandings, from miscommunications about priority handling, failure to declare an emergency, and confusion about fuel and weather conditions, was pushing Flight 052 closer to disaster. At this point, the conditions surrounding Avianca Flight 052 had become nearly impossible to overcome. The pilots were acutely aware of their dire fuel situation, as indicated by the cockpit voice recorder, capturing the flight engineer reading out the abnormal procedures for flying with less than 1,000 pounds of fuel in each of the 4 main tanks. With near-empty tanks, any sharp change in pitch could cause the fuel to slosh away from the pump inlets, risking engine flameout. The crew had to be extremely careful with every maneuver. A mounting sense of dread was likely building in their stomachs, as the reality of their situation set in. Successful landing was far from guaranteed. For several more minutes, Flight 052 continued receiving normal handling from air traffic control, with progressive clearances to lower altitudes and vectors towards the final approach. Despite their fuel concerns, the crew continued to hold on to the belief that they were being given special priority accommodation. The first officer even reassured the captain, saying, "They are giving us priority, but in reality, they were not being given any special treatment. The controllers were simply managing the landing sequence as they would for any other flight." By 2111, TRACON cleared Flight 052 to intercept the ILS approach for runway 22L, and they were instructed to contact the tower. The crew successfully intercepted the localizer to align with the runway, then began preparing to intercept the glide slope. This was the most critical phase of the approach, as the captain would have to manually fly the approach using only raw data instrumentation, due to the malfunctioning flight director and the absence of autopilot. Coupled with the reported wind shear, low visibility, and critically low fuel, this was undoubtedly the most challenging and high-stakes approach the captain had ever attempted. Inside the cockpit, the pressure was mounting. The captain continued to struggle with the stress of the situation, even snapping at the first officer to tell me things louder, a clear sign that the weight of the situation was taking its toll on him. By 2118, Flight 052 began to intercept the glide slope, with the pilots progressively extending the flaps to their maximum setting of 50 degrees and lowering the landing gear. However, this flap setting was not permitted with the hush kits that equipped the aircraft, as it generated excessive drag. This additional drag likely made the already difficult approach even harder for the captain. Meanwhile, Another aircraft encountered a wind shear worse than what had been reported, but this information was never passed on to Flight 052. The captain, attempting to follow the glide slope, struggled due to a strong 60-knot headwind that resulted in a lower ground speed than normal. This caused the plane to begin descending below the glide slope, and as the first officer called out corrections, the captain overcorrected, a common issue when flying raw data. Without the flight director, the captain was relying entirely on his manual judgment, making it easy to misinterpret the raw data indicators. At 21:20, JFK Tower cleared Flight 052 to land and reported a wind change to 90 degrees at 20 knots. This, combined with the 60-knot headwind the aircraft was experiencing, meant that the crew would soon encounter a 40-knot decrease in wind speed, a phenomenon known as negative wind shear. While positive wind shear increases airspeed and lift, negative wind shear has the opposite effect, causing a decrease in airspeed and potentially leading to a dangerous descent. As they passed through 1,000 feet, the first officer continued to warn, slightly below glide slope, but the captain continued to overcorrect. The struggle to maintain the glide slope intensified, and by 21:22, the wind shear hit. The headwind decreased rapidly by 30 to 40 knots in a matter of seconds, causing the airplane to descend rapidly. The first officer shouted, "This is the wind shear," as the ground proximity warning system blared, warning them of a dangerously steep descent. Sink rate, 500 feet. The situation was becoming critical as the airplane descended to just 200 feet above a residential neighborhood, only a mile and a half short of the runway. The first officer again warned, getting very low, but it was clear that the crew was running out of time and options. They were now in an extremely dangerous position, with little fuel left and no room for error. Their hope for a successful landing was rapidly slipping away, and the stakes could not have been higher. As the aircraft descended through the thick rain and fog, the ground proximity warning system sounded 13 separate times, each one a piercing reminder of the imminent danger. The flight crew desperately scanned the darkened sky, searching for the runway, but the cloud ceiling was at 200 feet, and visibility was down to just a quarter of a mile. The combination of rain, fog, and deteriorating conditions made it impossible to spot the runway. In the cockpit, the tension was palpable. The captain frantically called out, "Where is it?" And the first officer responded, "I don't see it. I don't see it." In that moment, the captain realized the tragic truth. They would not be able to land. With no other option, he made the fateful decision to go around and try again, hoping for a better outcome. The call to "Give me gear up" marked the beginning of their desperate attempt to escape the descending nightmare. By this time, Flight 052 only had about 10 minutes of fuel remaining. Even if they had immediately turned back to the outer marker and tried the approach again, it was unclear whether they would have enough fuel to make it. But in a final act of desperation, they had to try. Unfortunately, what followed only made their chances slimmer. As the captain initiated the go-around, he instructed the first officer to request another traffic pattern. The flight engineer, aware of the critical fuel situation, reminded the captain to be gentle with the nose to prevent the fuel from sloshing, which could lead to engine flameouts. In the midst of this, the first officer reported over the radio that they were heavy, signaling the serious weight of their situation. Kennedy Tower, unaware of the urgency, responded with instructions to turn left onto an outbound heading and climb to 2,000 feet, the intercept altitude for the ILS approach. Hearing these instructions, the captain attempted to communicate their dire fuel state. He said, "We don't have fuel," but the first officer simply read back the clearance and made no further protest. The captain then added, "I don't know what happened with the runway. I didn't see it." And finally, in a last-ditch effort to alert the tower, he said, "Tell them we are in an emergency." When the first officer informed Kennedy Tower that they were running out of fuel, it was clear that the gravity of the situation was finally being communicated. However, they still didn't use the word emergency, a crucial step in signaling the urgency of their plight. The tower controller, not understanding the full extent of the emergency, did not inquire about how much fuel was left, nor did they alter their approach to assist Flight 052 accordingly. This is a critical moment in the story. The pilots believed their request for priority handling had communicated the emergency status to air traffic control, but in reality, it hadn't. The misunderstanding about the urgency of their situation continued to snowball. The controller didn't perceive the flight as an emergency, and instead, they instructed the crew to contact TRACON for resequencing, a routine procedure for flights in the landing queue. This would not have happened if the controller had understood that Flight 052 was facing an actual emergency. As the aircraft continued through the outbound turn, the controller instructed them to climb to 3,000 feet to re-enter the approach queue. The captain, aware that climbing would burn precious fuel, told the first officer to inform the controller that they were running out of fuel. However, once again, the first officer merely acknowledged the climb instruction and added, "We're running out of fuel." The climb to 3,000 feet was a decision that would only worsen their fuel situation, yet the crew complied without question, continuing to spiral into a situation beyond their control. The controller, unaware of the true emergency, proposed a route that would take the aircraft 15 miles northeast before turning back to the approach. The flight engineer commented that the controller sounded frustrated, and the first officer meekly responded, "I guess so. Thank you very much." Then, a long silence filled the cockpit, a silence that reflected the resignation the crew was beginning to feel. Resignation is one of the 5 hazardous attitudes that pilots are trained to recognize and avoid. It's the feeling that there's nothing more to be done, that all hope is lost, and that continuing to fight is futile. In this case, it seemed that the crew had succumbed to this mindset even before the go-around, as they accepted increasingly detrimental instructions that pushed them further into jeopardy. The critical error here was allowing themselves to go with the flow, accepting circumstances as they were, rather than staying proactive and in control of the situation. By not questioning the decisions and not actively seeking alternatives, the crew allowed events to control them, and this proved to be a fatal mistake. In the face of extreme pressure and worsening conditions, the pilots of Flight 052 were caught between trying to meet the demands of air traffic control, their own limited understanding of the emergency, and the unrelenting challenge of managing a fuel crisis. The tragedy of Flight 052 is a tragic illustration of how a combination of technical failures, miscommunications, and psychological factors can lead to a disaster when decisions are not made with a full understanding of the gravity of the situation. At 21:32, with the fuel gauges now reading near zero, Flight 052 began its base turn to intercept the localizer for a second approach to JFK. Seconds later, the fuel tanks ran dry, and the engines began to shut down, one after another. As the sounds of the engines rolling back echoed through the cockpit, the flight engineer called out, "Flame out! Flame out on engine 4! Just moments later, he added, "Flame out on engine 3, and then 2, and finally 1. With the remaining engines on the verge of failure, the captain desperately called out, "Show me the runway!" But they were still 15 miles away, flying over the north shore of Long Island. In those final moments, the first officer pleaded, "We just lost 2 engines and we need priority, please." But by then, it was far too late. The controller gave them a final heading to intercept the localizer, but that was the last transmission anyone heard from Avianca Flight 052. The cockpit voice recorder captured the pilots setting up their instruments for the approach, but it abruptly ended as the remaining engines flamed out, cutting off the aircraft's last bit of electrical power. With no engines and no electrical power, the lights went out, and an eerie quiet descended on the aircraft as it glided down through the howling wind and rain. The crew could do nothing but hope for a flat, open place to land, but unfortunately, that was not to be. At 21:34, Avianca Flight 052 slammed nose first into a wooded hillside in the village of Cove Neck on Long Island. The impact was catastrophic, breaking the fuselage into 3 pieces and coming to a sharp stop. The nose section was catapulted over a hilltop and into a backyard, while the main fuselage came to rest on a nearly 45-degree slope, with its tail lying across a residential road. Inside the cabin, the force of the impact caused the seats to buckle and rip out of the floor, sending passengers crashing into their surroundings with devastating consequences. Among the 158 passengers and crew, the crash claimed the lives of 73 people, including all 3 pilots and 5 of the 6 cabin crew members. Of the 85 survivors, all except 2 infants suffered serious injuries, including broken bones, severe head trauma, and other life-threatening injuries. Miraculously, there was no fire, as the aircraft had no fuel left. The National Transportation Safety Board's final report concluded that the cause of the accident was the failure of the flight crew to exercise adequate fuel management and their failure to effectively communicate the emergency situation to air traffic control. Contributing factors included the crew's failure to request updated information about the worsening weather in the New York area, improper traffic flow management by the Central Flow Control Facility, and the high difficulty of flying the manual raw data approach in such challenging conditions under stress. In the years following the crash of Avianca Flight 052, significant safety reforms were implemented across the aviation industry. The way expected further clearance times were issued was overhauled, and air traffic controllers were strongly encouraged to ask flight crews for more information if they suspected any issues with fuel. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, also established the first unified global standards for airmen's English to ensure effective communication between pilots from different countries. This crash, along with other disasters like the Kegworth air disaster, also led the FAA to implement new seat design standards for airlines. These new standards ensured that seats could withstand an impact of up to 16 Gs and remain anchored in place, even if the floor was severely damaged. Avianca Flight 052 remains a crucial case study in how a series of passive, favorable assumptions and failures to reassess options can lead a crew into a situation with no escape. This tragedy is a powerful reminder for pilots and for everyone about the importance of staying proactive, planning for contingencies, and constantly reassessing the situation when circumstances change. The lessons learned from this disaster continue to shape aviation safety protocols and serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency and poor communication. It underscores the importance of always questioning assumptions, no matter how confident one might feel, and of seeking out the truth of a situation, even when it seems uncomfortable or difficult to face.